This week on the Lectures in History podcast, Wayne State University professor Elizabeth Faue discusses the American working class and labor movements during the 1970s. Class starts right after this.
Hi, it's John from C-SPAN. Imagine 45 years ago, when there were just a handful of television networks, C-SPAN first went on the air bringing an unfiltered view of government directly to America's living rooms. No spin, no commentary, just pure democracy in action.
And it's Janae from C-SPAN. It was a bold experiment. We finally had a front row seat to Congress, the White House, and the campaign trail, all without government funding.
As we celebrate 45 years and a legacy of unfiltered access, we ask for your support of a donation in honor of over 4 decades of service. Your gift, no matter how big or small, will help maintain this vital resource for access to the democratic process.
And you can help ensure another 45 years of witnessing history unfold and empowering citizens to be informed and engaged in the political process. Visit cspan.org/donate today and join our 45th anniversary campaign.
Thanks for supporting C-SPAN, your unfiltered view of government. Visit cspan.org/donate today to make your gift of support. Thanks.
I'm Elizabeth Faue, a professor in the Department of History, and I'm here as your guest lecturer today in American labor history. I'd like to welcome you to my world and to talk a little bit about the 1970s. In many ways, the 1970s are probably the most contested historical turf right now. As we talked about before, historians change their minds. They find new evidence, they find new arguments and new takes on the decades that they study. And the 1970s is really no different. I think originally, following pop culture, we tended to think of them as sort of the rebellion light decade, in which people would focus on disco and focus on the conservative backlash. But in fact, they're one of the most important decades for the American working class and in labor history. So today's title, The Times They Are Changing, apologies to Bob Dylan, is really about how this decade was a decade of fundamental change in the workplace, in the workforce, and in work organizations. It also was a change in the context in which all of those 3 things operated. So focusing on worker militancy, the diversity of the working class, and the emerging service economy, we're going to talk about this decade, which is usually called the long 1970s, starting at about 1967 or 1968 and going through the early 80s. We're going to talk about that decade and the changes that the working class or classes experienced. I'd like to actually begin by noting UAW President Douglas Fraser, who at the time said that there seemed to be a one-sided class war being fought against the working class. And when he's talking about that, he's talking about the sweeping economic changes and political changes that seem to undermine and threaten not just the labor movement, but the very livelihood of its members and of workers in general. Let's talk about just a few of those changes. Some of the most important trends in employment and labor had to do with the sort of phenomenal growth of the labor force in the 1960s. Some of this actually did have to do with a slight growth in immigration. But it also had to do with the fact that more women and younger men and women were joining the labor force. Ironically, this occurs at the same time in which you saw a decline in manufacturing. Productivity gains through automation and robotics tended to drive down demand for labor in manufacturing, but other sectors, notably the government sector, but also retail, clerical, and the information sector in general were expanding. So unionization over the course of this decade drops from 1962, in which the proportion of the labor force that was unionized was 32.4%, to 1973, in which it had dropped to 28.5%, and there were further declines over the rest of the decade. In 1968, minimum wage reached peak purchasing power, and there really was no significant increase in the purchasing power of the minimum wage until post-2020. Strikes between 1966 and 1973, and then further on in the 1970s, really increased dramatically. And the labor reform movements that were behind many of these strikes really fueled that labor action. Non-union private sector employment as a result of all of these things begins to increase, while service, information, and government sectors experience great growth in unionized employment. I think key to this, and it's something that we don't think very often, is the rise of the information economy. In this slide, there's a lot of very specific notes about the growth in artists and teachers. But I think what's most important is to remember that the economy at the time is expanding, and it's expanding in stuff like education and culture, areas of information exchange, and also the slow growth of computerization, which begins already by the 1970s. All of this is important because the information sector prior to this is actually very poorly organized, with a few exceptions like the newspaper and actors. But the other piece of this is that the areas where companies are moving and expanding, developing new businesses, are areas that involve training people, educating people, finding information, researching information, but also interpreting, analyzing, and distributing or communicating that information, which means that the sector becomes important by the 1960s, and as we can tell from the past year, has basically become a very dominant force, not just in the economy, but in the labor movement. Parallel to this is an increase in public sector. Now, what do we mean by that? We basically are talking about the area in which governments, local, state, county, or federal governments are employing people to do essential tasks, essential services for taxpayers. And the growth of that sector that has a lot to do with the growth of new government programs like Social Security and eventually health insurance by our period, but also even such things as the growth in the Department of Motor Vehicles means that more and more people are going to be hired by the government. And at the beginning of the decade, despite the fact that, like in 1969, there were almost 12 million workers in the public sector, there was actually a prohibition against their collectively bargaining or going on strike. And while this changes over the course of the 60s and 70s, that tension between people being employed by government and having the same rights as private workers becomes an essential part of the politics and labor activism of the decade. Those new sectors also employ people who are new workers. Women's labor force participation has the most dramatic. But also African Americans in the labor force also increased their numbers, especially in the new sectors. New immigration from Asia, Latin America, and Africa will change the composition of the labor force. And this is enabled, in fact, by the Immigration Reform Act in 1965, so that more than 20 million new immigrant workers will enter the labor force. It's also affected by the growth of undocumented workers and their movement into the labor force in the course of the decade. In terms of women's labor force participation, we have to go back to the 1950s to look at the contrast here. In the 1930s, for instance, you begin to see a blip in married women's employment, but women still constitute a fairly minor part of the labor force, maybe 25 to 30%. And women have very irregular and oftentimes interrupted work histories. But by the 1950s, women's work participation changes dramatically. And it changes so both in the sort of number of women in the labor force, but also the character of that. While there's a growth in women's part-time employment, it's also paired with a growth in women's full-time employment. While there's a growth in total women being employed, married women become a very significant part of the female labor force. So too do women with children, a fact that actually has further impact by making the childcare sector also a new growth area in the economy. Women began to think about and take on lifelong work patterns or careers, and they become much more politically active because work participation tends to track very closely with political participation. The broad political context of all of this is that there's a tremendous change in the way that people think about government and the way that government acts toward individuals and workers. Throughout the course of the 1960s and 1970s, there was a broadening of worker rights, especially in the area of public employee rights. In addition, there are also specific laws in the federal government that change labor force participation and its consequences by increasing the emphasis on equality within the workplace, both equality of opportunity, but also equality of compensation. So in 1963, for instance, we have the growth of feminism through various organizations, and it basically rolls into the Equal Pay Act of 1963. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act not only guarantees certain rights in terms of non-discrimination in hiring, promotion, and compensation, our Title VII, but guarantee this regardless of race or sex. It emphasizes equal pay. It emphasizes equal opportunity in hiring. It emphasizes the rights of workers to seek promotion on equal grounds. This is extremely important, not just for the labor force, but for how workplaces are organized and how workers interact, and eventually how unions can use such legislation to support workers and to use those laws to, in essence, fight for equality within the workplace. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, while it seems to be not directly connected, is directly connected because the political representation of workers across race is so important for who gets elected to governments and how governments implement legislation. There are throughout the decade of the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s cases about legal representation, judicial process, but also the implementation of these key worker rights bills. The result of all of this is a union growth in the public sector. In 1955, for example, public sector unions had about 400,000 members in total. But by the 1970s, membership had risen over tenfold to over 4 million workers who belonged to public employee unions. Some good examples of this are some of the fastest growing unions in the period. AFSCME, or the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, and the National Education Association all grow dramatically in terms of their membership. And the AFT, NEA, and SEIU, that is the Service Employees International Union, wind up accounting for a good proportion of organized labor, especially within the public sector. This organization inevitably led to labor action and workers being involved in trying to renegotiate or demand better working conditions and better compensation. In the period between 1968 and 1977, for example, there are over 5,000 strikes per year, with over 2.5 million workers on strike per year. More than 3 million were on strike in 1970 and 1971. And these strikes are not just union-led, but are often wildcat actions that are pursued by workers who are trying to push unions to demand more rights and greater action. Some of the rank and file rebels, as they were known, included within the United Mine Workers an organization called the Miners for Democracy, and the Teamsters for a Democratic Union. In the United Auto Workers, several groups, including New Directions, the Dodge Revolutionary Union Movement, and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. And within the United Steelworkers Union, Steelworkers Fight Back. All of these organizations pushed these unions to capitalize on this new activism and new rank and file militancy against the conditions of the 1970s workplace. And that surge in labor activism doesn't start to taper off until 1981 with the PATCO strike, which would signal an end to this wave of labor insurgency. I want to talk just briefly before I get into the next topic about what the conditions are that these workers and unions are concerned about. Now, when it comes to teachers, there's a whole package of things that happens in the decade in the 1960s that means that workers within any school district, whether they're teachers or public building service employees or people who work in the cafeteria line, are looking at schools that have greater demands on them. The wave of baby boomers that goes through that sort of expand the population of schools, but also school districts that still keep very tight control over the public budget. In addition to that, even as early as the 1960s, and this continues to be true today, there's been a deterioration of the public schools in terms of building facilities. So today we may be talking about lead pipes and leading to water coolers, but even in the 1960s and 1970s, buildings that had been put into place, sometimes temporary buildings that were erected outside of the 1920s or 1930s high schools, were literally falling apart. And by the 1970s and 1980s, these physical hazards are on the radar of the teachers' unions and of other public employee unions. In addition to all of that, there is an escalation of violence in the schools. And workers, that is teachers, cafeteria workers, secretaries in the offices, are all responding to an environment in which there are greater tensions and greater violence, and an unwillingness on the part of school boards to do anything but the most punitive actions toward individuals, oftentimes African American or Latino youth, to expel or suspend, rather than dealing systemically with the causes of violence in the schools. So that these issues become sort of front and center for the teachers' unions of the 1970s. But if we go to something more in line with traditional labor history, which is manufacturing in the decade, what you would have seen in the course of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is a ramping up of occupational hazards in factories. Chemical hazards as new chemicals are introduced into manufacturing processes, but also because there is within those factories an incredible pressure to continually up production, to up the speed of the production line and production quotas for individual workers. The rate of accidents is just escalating. All of this combined with the economic pressures of the time and with this sense of not sort of being able to keep up to an ever-changing economy fuels worker discontent. And it emerges in these strikes, both in the public and the private sector. It emerges also in the demands for union reform, precisely because the workplace itself and its connections with the community were further imperiled and need to be addressed. And that the machinery that was there to address it is inadequate to an expanding sense of worker rights, but also an expanding need for worker protections. All of that fuels the kind of militancy I'm talking about. But we can also look very specifically at public employee worker actions. In this case, just the number of work stoppages in the public sector that escalates from 1958, and there are only 15 work stoppages, throughout the course of the 1960s, in which that average number of work stoppages basically increases to about 400 work stoppages a year. Some of the most specific and most dramatic strikes in the public sector are in the two areas I talked about. We're talking about public sectors in general, but also in the specific field of education. During the 1960s, teachers go on strike more than 300 times in more than 1,000 school districts and are involved in at least 2,000 to 3,000 other work actions. The 1968, which is this pivotal year, also sees the emergence of new unions to take on these conditions. Also in 1968, I think dramatically, and almost everyone knows about this, there's the Memphis sanitation worker strike, in which sanitation workers who have felt long abused and unrepresented and uncompensated starts in Memphis, Tennessee, and has to do, again, I mean, this sort of trigger moment is when 2 sanitation workers are killed by a sanitation truck machinery misfunction. They are basically killed, and it sparks this anger, but also a sense that sanitation workers have to stand up for their rights. And Martin Luther King famously comes down to Memphis to basically rally with and stand behind workers as a matter of justice, not just for the working man, justice for the working man, as well as justice for African American workers. We see here a sign, "There is no halfway house on the road to freedom." Finally, in 1970, and again, this is very strike, there's a postal workers strike in March that involves most major cities and over 150,000 strikers. Not surprisingly, women workers who are new to the workplace are also underrepresented in labor unions, at least at the beginning of the decade. And by the end of the decade, we'll see a real growth in their membership. How was this fueled? We could talk about the emergence as early as 1950s and possibly earlier of labor feminism. That is, women who work in the labor movement, for the labor movement, or in women's organizations who see a connection between women's labor force participation and their ability to get union protections with the cause of women's equality in society. By the 1960s, groups like the National Organization for Women and the Women's Equity Action League began to press for and succeed in getting new legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Equal Pay Act of '63, to directly address women's inequality in the workplace. That act, which sort of becomes famously known by the shorthand of Title VII, changes everything from the way that you look for a job to the kind of opportunities that become open to women. I think shockingly, for people who grew up in the 1980s or later, there's no recognition at all that job ads, which right now appear online, but then used to be in print, were actually coded by sex. Work wanted, a man would write, and he would specify, or work wanted, a woman would write. But also as a, say, worker wanted male, worker wanted female. And these ads very specifically said, this job is not for you if you don't belong to this biological sex. Do not show up at the door if you are female for a carpenter's job. Do not show up at the door for a flight attendant's job if you are male. So there's a very clear separation beginning with the job ad, but also through the interview process, through a ranking of candidates, and even the content of interviews. What Title VII was meant to do was to create far greater equality of opportunity by sort of leveling the playing field, but also making sure that people got asked the same questions, that credentials were weighed on both sides of the line, and that past inequalities would at least prioritize the hiring of excluded groups. It didn't guarantee it, but it guarantees that it would be considered in the hiring process. And this movement, which opened up all kinds of professions, occupations, and job categories to women, really is the context within which women's labor union participation needs to be considered. So through the course of the 1960s and 70s, it became clear that women needed a voice. And through that decade, you get the creation of the Coalition of Labor Union Women, but also some very specific initiatives to bring women into the workplace and give them greater equality. Some of these would literally be programs that were set out in the 1970s to recruit women into the building trades, into the skilled trades. But to look at something a little bit more traditional, we could also look at the growth of clerical unionism. There are very few women who work in clerical jobs in the 1960s who are represented by unions. And probably most of those work in the public sector for government agencies. But banks, insurance companies, even retail stores, other places, hiring offices in corporations, other kinds of clerical work tend to be unrepresented by unions and tend to be workplaces incredibly difficult to organize. And that's an entirely different lecture, but to focus very specifically on a few things is that there also was no labor union ready to take this on. And so what you saw in the course of the 60s and 70s was that women's groups, especially groups of women workers, such as 9 to 5, which was a group in Boston, decided that it's really time to basically bring women into the labor movement where statistically they would earn higher wages and have greater benefits. And so they do that basically by tapping specific workplaces. One of the key arenas for this in the course of the 70s and 80s was actually within higher education, where university clericals at places like Columbia, Boston University, University of Minnesota, University of Illinois, NYU, begin to organize among themselves. Some of them aided by 9 to 5, which becomes subsidiary or a member of SEIU, an affiliate union, but also independent unions that later would connect up with the UAW or AFSCME to bring university clericals into a bigger national union that might help them to pursue their goals, but also provide a structure and process for bargaining and contracts. All of this was sort of a consequence of the expansion of rights, but in turn expanded women's rights. Up to now, we've been talking about sort of a story of success. One of the reasons why the 70s is sort of seen as this turbulent decade, if you look at it from a labor historian's perspective. But it's not uniform, universal, or continuing success. To refer back to Fraser's comment about the one-sided war on the working class, a lot of it had to do with changing economic and political circumstances that began to limit workers' rights, failed to support union rights, but also changed fundamentally the economic context in which unions operated. Key among these, anybody who looks at the 70s, was the energy crisis and its impact on the workforce. So the energy crisis has a tremendous impact on the economy, and especially on the manufacturing sector. The explanation probably goes back to the 1940s, but the most precipitating factor was the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, when OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, declared an oil embargo. This embargo signaled the growth of Arab nationalism. Can I do that again? OPEC's embargo signaled the growth of Arab nationalism and a pan-Arab political movement. But it was also, as someone said, the sort of an energy Pearl Harbor. The United States has always had easy access to petroleum supplies, not just in its own country, but in the Middle East. Suddenly is dealing with the drastic decline of oil exports and the increase in prices. Between January of 1973 and January of 1974, oil prices increased over 350%, the result of which was not just lines at the gas station or a certain amount of social turmoil and fear, not to mention oil spurred inflation, but also that workers were faced with the reality both of rising prices and of a manufacturing sector that was trying to decrease its energy consumption and reduce its labor force. At the same time, when this embargo was going on, oil company profits, and this includes American companies, go up 70% during 1973 and another 40% in 1974. All of this meant that the manufacturing sector needed to respond. It was in particularly looking at consumer demand, which was changing and which began to favor, because of oil prices, fuel efficient cars that were smaller with more efficient engines. And they looked not to the United States automakers, which had not produced the same kind of car, but rather to Japanese-made economy and fuel-efficient cars like Toyota, Datsun, now Nissan, and VWs from Germany. This meant a severe decline in domestic auto sales and manufacture, with the auto companies laying off workers. General Motors, for example, laid off 38,000 workers permanently and 48,000 workers temporarily, beginning a 3-decade-long drop in domestic automobile production. And the UAW, the principal union of auto workers, losing membership. Less American automobile production also had other effects. The demand for American steel declines in the 70s and 1980s. It also meant that communities in which auto workers lived would experience a decline in tax revenues, would experience outmigration, would experience a change in the kind of economy that drove their bottom line from cities and counties in what becomes called the Rust Belt, but also even a change in who in the town would be the most prominent, what factors in society would begin to dominate in politics. The steel industry also, as I noted, was a kind of collateral damage to OPEC. The US steel industry begins to collapse, and in Youngstown, Ohio, one of the major steel producing centers, in 1977 experienced a severe crisis. Youngstown Sheet and Tube closes Campbell Mill that fall, moving in 1977 the major portion of its domestic steel production to Indian Harbor Works near Chicago. Of the 22,000 workers employed by the company, 5,000 Youngstown workers were unemployed. U.S. Steel's Youngstown plant soon followed suit in 1979 and 1980 with another 10,000 lost jobs. So the steel industry collapsed, but not just in Youngstown, across the United States. In 1977 alone, 21,940 permanent jobs were lost and 19 steel plants were closed in 8 states. It has an enormous impact on the economic vitality of the Midwest and also the viability of labor unions that were heavily organized in the manufacturing sector. Okay. In the 1980s, there were over 200,000 workers in the United States employed in electronics. By 2000, outsourcing production of electronics abroad led to a sharp decline. Only 20,000 workers were working in electronics in the United States by 1990. And if you compared that to where the electronics in manufacturing moved, which is in the Maquiladora zone between Mexico and the United States, more than 500 Maquiladora electronics factories were built in the period. Workers also began to change because if you looked at manufacturing in the United States, it was predominantly white and male in the 1970s. The Maquiladora factories, which began to produce electronics goods in the 1970s, were workforces that were predominantly female and also Mexican or Mexican American. Offshore manufacturing also produced the vast majority of electronics goods, so that in Asia, Latin America, and Central America, you would see the majority of electronics production. When manufacturing goes, what steps in? We talked a little bit about the information sector, and I think there is an expansion in the cultural industry, but it's more significant and certainly more prominent that workers who are no longer employed in manufacturing tend to be hired in the retail and the service sector more broadly. By the 1990s, let me use an example. The average job in the 1950s was probably a manufacturing job, maybe as late as the 1960s. But by the 1970s and the 1980s, the average job would have been in retail. It wouldn't have been in manufacturing, or it would have been in general in the service industry. And in the 1990s, your stereotypical job was more likely at a Walmart or at a McDonald's than it would have been in any kind of manufacturing or professional sector. Walmart as a corporation also changes what that landscape looks like, not just in retail, but in manufacturing, because Walmart begins to make contracts with and source its supply of goods from abroad. In Guangdong province in China, more than 400 million migrant workers were employed to basically produce goods for the American market, with 130,000 garment shops, new cities that included, for instance, Shenzhen, which grew from no city at all to 7 million people in 25 years, and old cities like Guangzhou, Old Canton, basically expanding its population to fuel the new industry. The big box stores contracted for production and consumer taste and retail preferences with very small margins with Asian manufacturers in particular. The low prices meant low wages in this sector. And the average American wage first becomes stagnant and then begins to drop in the course of the 1970s. So what does that have to do with today? Did the war on the American working class succeed? In effect, it had some impact that included stagnant wages for over 2 decades. As I said at the beginning of this, the purchasing power of the minimum wage doesn't change between the 1960s and the pandemic year of 2020, where labor demand and labor supply play a role in beginning to slowly increase the minimum wage and its purchasing power, alongside wages like the Living Wage campaign and the Fight for 15 to increase the wages and compensation, not just essential workers, but workers who work in the low-paid service sector, in food service and transportation, and in retail. And fundamentally, the increase of compensation in that sector tended to also lead to increased wages and compensation packages in other essential fields like healthcare and education. But we have to be honest, the unionization rate in 2024 is under 11%, although popular support for unions is the highest it's been since the 1960s. There's been a tremendous growth in inequality since the 1970s, especially in income inequality. And it certainly has fueled political division, but also a new militancy among working people. Our economy is increasingly service-based and information-based, and our growing understanding of what that means for us has led to growing worker organization. The gig economy has left workers now fighting for union representation and the right to organize, fights that have begun to show real traction in 2023 and in 2024. The pandemic crisis, which was unimagined in the 1970s, laid bare just how workers remain on the front line of risks, not just the risks that we talked about in the 1970s of speed up in manufacturing machinery, leading to greater worker death and worker injury, but also during the pandemic, risk of infection, risk of death. And we could also say the kind of conditions that prevailed both in the pandemic and afterwards, which left workers across the board more exposed to working conditions with increased risk of disease, injury, and death, which would fundamentally change the way that people saw their work. And finally, the understanding that has come about in the midst of these conditions that workers are now at the front line of this new labor militancy. It's not the old unions, although old unions like the auto workers, the steel workers, and the mine workers and the Teamsters still exist. And they take in higher education workers. They provide a structure and sometimes resources and assets, but also new unions that look over the landscape and begin to ask, what should a labor union look like? Who should be members? What are the legitimate boundaries and the correct aspirations for workers using labor unions or worker organizations within the workplace? So, a very old question that dates back to the 19th century I think it's Chernyshevsky, who was a Russian, who first asked the question in the pamphlet, what is to be done? History classes really exist to have you think about what history provides in the way of answers to the similar questions that we might have today. And I would ask you to think about what are the issues that move labor today after nearly 50 years of deindustrialization and labor movement decline, but also after the new spark of militancy, the new wave of understanding about the workplace and about the role of work and its appropriate rights and compensations. 2023 was not a strike year like 1919, 1934, 1946, 1959. It didn't even match the strike heights of the 1970s, when an average of 2 million workers went out on 5,000 strikes a year. But unions and collective action are center stage again. According to ILR's labor tracker, 2023 saw 500. According to labor tracker, 2023 saw 451 strike actions in 717 locations involving more than 500,000 workers. In 2023 alone, the UAW won major contracts with three major U.S. automakers in a historic strike. Writers and actors went out on strike for the Writers Guild and SAG-AFTRA. The United Parcel Service and Kaiser Permanente went out on strike. Kaiser Permanente's SEIU local involved the largest healthcare workers' strike in U.S. history, with more than 75,000 workers on strike. Hotel and casino workers in Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and Detroit, airline pilots, and more workplaces and companies have seen organizing drives than we have seen for the past 2 decades. Executive Director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy at Harvard, a woman named Sharon Bloch, basically said that the alliance of the public and labor movement in this year, in this period of time, has potential to influence the dynamics even more in 2024 than in 2023. So when you're thinking about the 1970s, the parallel of both an economy in flux faced with new challenges and dangers, along with an undercurrent of discontent and activism, when you think about those parallels, that historical experience, what do you predict for the United States and the labor movement going forward? Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find even more history content, visit c-span.org/AHTV.